Well, first, thank you so much for um, inviting me and for the opportunity to participate. My sincere apologies that I couldn't be with you in person. I do have a number of restrictions that just would have made it very difficult for me to be in Qatar. It's my loss that I'm not there. I would also thank Tariq Ramadan because he's the one that convinced me to take part. Um, my understanding is that he's not taking participating in the seminar. Um, again, my apologies for not being with you, and I hope that you have a very fruitful and productive conversation. Perhaps from I'll start uh, my talk about the issue of migration first from a Muslim perspective. Then I'll say something about the international law that governs issues of migration, and then circle back to Islamic, what might be termed Islamic moral impulses, a tradition that could be developed, but so far, in my view, a tradition that has not been developed. Perhaps a good starting point would be the Quranic verse وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ وَحَمَلْنَاهُم فِي الْبَرِّ وَالْبَحْرِ وَرَزَقْنَاهُم الطَّيِّبَاتِ وَفَضَّلْنَاهُمْ عَلَى كَثِيرٍ مِّمَّنْ خَلَقْنَا تَفْضِيلًا. The Quran comments in Surah Al-Isra that God dignified human beings, Bani Adam, and has facilitated to them mobility in earth and the seas, and bestowed bounties upon them, and distinguished human beings over much of other God's creations or creatures. I've always been struck in by the discourse of this verse, the idea that mobility and travel, the ability to traverse earth and sea, the idea that mobility and access in the form of travel is perhaps a constituent element in human dignity. That in fact denial of mobility detracts from dignity, our dignity as human beings. Now, of course, the other Quranic discourse that easily lends itself to the issue of migration is one that I'm sure all of us are familiar with, addressing إن الذين توفاهم الملائكة ظالمي أنفسهم, those who the angels come to arrest their souls, and they are in a state of inequity. And then we have this discourse of the heavens asking those individuals what prevent them from migrating, and especially the comment that Ardullahi wasi'a, the wasn't God's earth vast and extensive for you to migrate. And the critical point here is that they exist in a state of oppression because they are powerless. They are in a condition of istidaf, as the Quranic discourse goes. And the way to address this powerlessness and this istidaf is through migration. Now, reading the Quranic verse in Surah Al-Isra with the verse in Surah Al-Nisa, there is a rather fascinating conjunction and a point of normative meeting between the idea of an earth that has been bestowed and granted to human beings in general, and that mobility and travel is an essential element for, or a constituent element for the dignity of human beings. Now, of course, we know that the verse in Surah Al-Nisa, the verse about migration, we are told in various reports that it addressed a particular historical event. Muslims who converted in Mecca failed to join the Prophet in Medina, and as a result ended up fighting against Muslims in the Battle of Badr. And if this verse on migration is wedded to this specific historical circumstance, in other words, if we only read it as a verse that addresses those who converted to Islam but failed to join the Prophet in Medina, and as a result ended up joining the war in the Battle of Badr on the wrong side, then that verse is emptied of its normative content, and it becomes a verse wedded to a particular historical circumstance. As various commentators on the Qur'an note, that the issue is whether it addressed a historical event and is no longer normatively pertinent, or whether it, by the terms of its own phrasing, remains historically, normatively rather pertinent. Several commentators note that the verse is written in a form that is non-contextual and seems to create a normative imperative for Muslims. Now, having said this, of course I am aware of, and I'm sure as you are, that the various reports that attributed to the Prophet that goes to the effect of La Hijrata Ba'd al-Fath, that the duty of Hijrah has come to an end, or the normative impulse of Hijrah has come to an end after the Fath of Mecca, after the defeat of Mecca and the Islamization of Mecca. But nevertheless, as I'm sure you know, that the issue of Hijrah and the issue of Hijrah as a response to a state of oppressiveness and weakness, the Wajib al-Hijrah, remained a tantalizing normative challenge throughout Islamic history. Some theologians even saying that Hijrah is a spiritual migration from a state of inequity to a state of enlightenment in God, while others talked about Hijrah as an obligation wherever one can do Izhar al-Din, or when one can freely practice Islam, and so on. Now, I'll comment in a bit about two other possible ethical norms in the Islamic tradition, and that is the norm of diyafa, or wajib al-diyafa, hospitality, coupled with a very interesting ethical example of the Prophet establishing an institution of mu'akha, or a brotherhood between those who migrated from Mecca to Medina. Both create a fascinating normative precedent that could have been developed by contemporary Muslims into a significant moral impulse and an inspirational virtue. Hospitality added to a brotherhood between the natives and the migrants, added to migration as a normative response to a state of powerlessness, all of that could have, and plus the ethic of mobility as an essential component of human dignity, all of that I see as a moral impulse that could have been developed by modern Muslims into a significant theological slash ethical engagement with the modern world. And it could have, in fact, engaged in significant ways the discourses by Jewish scholars and Christian scholars about migration and its role in upholding human rights and human dignity. The reality, however, is that far from developing these normative impulses in their own tradition, Muslims rather became, in the contemporary age and the post-colonial age, became rather obsessed with the apologetics of proving that the essential compatibility between Islamic theology and law and international law, but not going beyond that. As if the conciliation or reconciling the Islamic tradition to whatever international law happens to say is a sufficient moral response to the challenges that confront human beings and the increasing phenomena of displaced populations. The reality, though, is that international law in dealing with migration and displacement of human beings is largely, continues to be largely inadequate. And so saying or trying to argue the point that Islam or Islamic law can be simply consistent with international law is not much of a moral advancement. We know that the Refugee Convention and the accompanying protocols to the Refugee Convention, Article 33 in particular, which is the operative article in much of the jurisprudence on migrants, provides the following: no contracting state shall expel or return, refoul, a refugee in any manner whatsoever to the frontiers of territories where his life or freedom would be threatened on account of his race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or a political opinion. The fact is that the Refugee Convention only addresses displaced individuals who have crossed an international border. The Refugee Convention does not cover this internal displacement, i.e. people who have been displaced but have not crossed an international border. Moreover, the Refugee Convention simply obligates contracting parties not to refoul or turn back to the frontiers of territories those individuals who are threatened on account of race, religion, nationality, social group, or political opinion. Now, these are very loaded legal terms. The state is not, those contracting parties to the Refugee Convention are not obligated to provide anything beyond the duty of non-refoulement. If the reason that someone is threatened falls out of the protected categories of race, religion, nationality, social group, or political opinion, states under the Refugee Convention can in fact refoul or send back individuals to areas where their life and safety can be at risk. Moreover, the obligations of Article 33 of the Refugee Convention are severely constrained by the acknowledgement that states can refoul those individuals who threaten a country's national security or its perceived political stability. So while we often talk in international law about the ideals of voluntary repatriation, local integration, or safe resettlement to a stable country, and we continue talking since World War II about durable solutions for displaced refugees, whether we are talking about groups of refugees such as Palestinians, Iraqis in Iran, Afghanis in Iran and Pakistan, Syrians in Turkey, Tibetans in Nepal, Filipinos in Malaysia, Angolans in Zambia, Sri Lankans in India, Mauritanians in Senegal, Rohingyas in Thailand, India, Malaysia, or Bangladesh, the durable solutions continue to elude us. And they continue to elude us because the international jurisprudence that governs displaced individuals, while speaking of the ideals of voluntary repatriation, local integration, or safe resettlement, does not have much teeth to it. It does not have the power to obligate nations to, in fact, provide durable solutions. So what has been going on for some 60 years is that we tax the already overtaxed UN High Commissioner's Office for Refugees to provide ad hoc solutions to displaced populations around the world, often condemning them to life in camps with tents or makeshift communities, while countries continue insisting on the framework of national sovereignty as an overarching paradigm in dealing and reacting to the crisis of displaced human beings around the world. One of the critical components missing in international law is there is no proportional obligation upon states such as the US or Russia that create displacement of migrants to take a proportional number of migrants for resettlement. In other words, a country like the United States can create an enormous amount of displacement in Iraq or Afghanistan, but wash its hands when it comes time to resettle refugees, simply throwing the obligation upon other countries such as Turkey, Pakistan, Kenya, Jordan, Chad, or, according to the latest statistics, Germany. There are numerous problems with the international legal framework dealing with forced migration and economic migration, and dealing with displaced individuals that continues to create a perpetual state of crisis in the world. The Muslim contribution in this ongoing state of crisis has been largely muted and ineffective. In fact, there has been a drift away from the Islamic tradition, which could have enriched international discourses by tapping into the theology of mu'akha, brotherhood, or diyafa, hospitality, or hijrah as a response to istisaf or oppression. But indeed, Muslim countries after the colonial era have in fact lagged behind Western countries that have reached a point of what some have called a post-nationalist paradigm. In other words, the West has successfully managed to reach a racially contingent post-nationalist reality in which they diluted the national borders between various Western countries. You can be an American citizen and travel all over Europe without a visa. You could be a British citizen and travel all over Europe without a visa. But Muslims, in fact, have deconstructed the concept of ummah, have deconstructed the concept of brotherhood, ukhuwah, have largely ignored their tradition of diyafa or hospitality to, in rather ironic and paradoxical ways, become more zealously defensive of the paradigm of nationalism and nationalist borders, even amongst Muslim countries themselves, in ways that have made them lag morally behind Western countries. Now, having said all of this, I do not see the Islamic legacy on Abode of Islam, Dar al-Islam, and Dar al-Harb or Dar al-Kufr as significant obstacles to the development of a moral response to the issue of displacement in the modern age. I do not see it as a significant obstacle because I think that Dar al-Islam is an ambiguous category, endlessly discursive in nature and endlessly negotiable. In my reading of the tradition, much of what is written on Dar al-Islam in the pre-modern era correlates and parallels discourses on Christendom or discourses in Judaism on the difference between Gentiles and Jews, and that, in fact, Muslims have found it sociologically easy to migrate from Muslim countries to non-Muslim countries if that meant attaining a greater degree of dignity and a greater degree of justice. What I see as a real challenge is that for Muslims to reinterrogate and rediscover their own rich tradition of what one can call virtue or ethics of virtue in the critical concepts of countering oppression and powerlessness through mobility and accessibility between Muslims themselves, first and foremost, and then second between Muslims and the other, and reclaiming their own virtue ethics of mu'akha, brotherhood, and diyafa or hospitality. These are concepts that could be easily shared with other biblical traditions and other theological traditions in Judaism and Christianity in a way that challenges modern international law that rather than simply apologetically rubber stamping modern international law. Now, I cannot conclude this statement without saying that it is shocking to the conscience the way that some Muslim countries have exceeded all moral paradigms, or rather has violated all moral paradigms in the way, for instance, Egypt deals with displacement among Bedouins in Sinai, or with Palestinians in Gaza, or the way that United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia have dealt with displacement in Yemen. It is a course of action or a pattern of practice that is not just offensive to modern concepts of humanitarian law, human rights, but even to the basic moral thrust of the Islamic tradition. The aspiration is that Muslims would investigate their own tradition to help construct a humanitarian paradigm that elevates the international moral trajectories rather than simply acquiescing with rubber stamping vague doctrines produced by nation states in search of their own national interests within the context of this international legal framework. And thank you very much. That concludes my prepared notes.
Thank you very much. That was a most stimulating and critical presentation, and I thank you very much for that. We have some time now. If you could stay with us for discussion and questions,
Sure.
We'd really appreciate it. It's open to the floor for anybody who would like to make a comment or a question with Dr. Abou El Fadl on the issues that he presented.
I'll be happy to. Professor, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Think.
Oh, it's an honor to have you in the room. Thank you so much for taking the time. I wanted to ask you quickly, you mentioned, and I agree completely, that most Muslim countries have abandoned making recourse to the rich Islamic tradition of ethics that could have helped inform and further international discourse about treatment of refugees and displaced people. I agree fully. However, what would you make of the Turkish case, which seems both in what the government has said and done with its treatment of the refugee population coming out of Syria? Would you say that that has been an example whereby your look at ethics, your look at reaching back into Islamic ethics may be proven? What would you say about the Turkish case?
That's a very good point. Turkey, rather than being, I wouldn't say is an example. I think Turkey is a good example of the paradoxes that modern Muslims struggle with. Muslims since the colonial era, rather than systematically developing a theology of an ethical theology and ethical visions for how the way that their traditions can create moral imperatives, have struggled with the in a rather sometimes very extreme ways with the paradigm of nationalism and national sovereignty, and coupled with rhetoric about Islamic brotherhood and Islamic fidelity. So with Turkey, initially I was very encouraged by some things that the Turkish government said about being inspired by how the Prophet created a brotherhood, a mu'akha, between the Ansar and Muhajirin, and that refugees are welcome as our brothers in the same way that the Ansar and Muhajirin were. But then, when after this initial rhetoric, reading human rights reports about the way that the refugees have actually been treated, and I can't say I am impressed. I mean, my knowledge of it comes largely from my work with Human Rights Watch and various reports that I've read. But it was thoroughly disappointing to me, and again, it emphasized this paradox. While Western nations have been able to reach a post-nationalist the reverence of the nation state with its boundaries. Now, having Western nations, a lot of critics say, well, they have done so on a racial basis. So, as long as property of whiteness is practiced, then we can dilute. But nevertheless, whether it's a racial basis or something else, I'm on the one hand, compared to some other Muslim countries, Turkey has a much better record when dealing with Syrian refugees. I mean, some Muslim countries have been shocking in their absolute refusal to extend any help to their brethren and their sisters. So, if compared to that, Turkey is much better. Compared to the ideals that Turkey itself invoked in the idea of mu'akha, then it's disappointing. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, no, thank you very much, Professor. No, I appreciate it. Obviously, it's something that I'm interested in exploring further. I do have to say that in the early stages, when the Turkish government thought that the crisis would be much shorter, they did do some extraordinary things in terms of refugee care that simply broke international precedent, both for good and bad. And much of that discourse at high levels and local levels was and continues to be surprisingly grounded and enmeshed in some classic Islamic understandings, even if these are mottos and these are phrases. In a world like ours, I find at least those small moments, hopeful. And so, inshallah, we can push further. Thank you.
I mean, I don't. Again, I want to just emphasize that compared to other countries in the region, Turkey is way ahead. I mean, so I don't want to take away from what has been comparatively a generous response to refugees. One of the ongoing critical problems that since the colonial age has plagued this region is that Muslim countries themselves are often are not the decisive forces in creating the reality or negating the reality of displacement. In other words, external forces continue to come into the region and create displaced populations and sort of putting the problem squarely in the lap of countries in the region. That type of, the thing that would be similar if Europe suddenly had huge displaced populations because the Chinese forces came in and started doing power play in power games in Europe. These types of dynamics often result in defensiveness and into a sort of a siege mentality. And not enough emphasis is directed at critiquing the main world powers and their role in creating displacement, even environmental displacement. There is a considerable amount of literature about the way that industrialized countries create environmental displacement and then shrug their shoulders and go on as if they haven't done anything. That is why I am disappointed in international law, and I don't think it is a sufficient framework for dealing with the realities of displacement. And the international law must be interrogated by moral communities, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Baha'i, Hindu, Buddhist, because otherwise I don't think humanity has a good trajectory.
Thank you very much. Sari, then Nina.
Thank you, Professor. I'm Fadl Sami Hanafi from American University of Beirut.
No, sir.
I really enjoy your talk and emphasizing that we should not only stand running the international law, but try to use Islamic ethics to make it more human. The example you brought specifically about admission migrants. With this thesis, I'm afraid that we should, also think how we don't reify what is Islamic ethics. I am saying this because I am thinking beyond this the concept of brotherhood, mobilities, but about all this this ethics of incorporating Muslims or migrants, generally speaking, in host society. And in these terms, I would say that we have clearly different traditions of understanding Islamic ethics. And myself, I work on fatwas about migration, and it's very clear there is a different schools of thought. And the more you, for instance, what I found it extremely for me rewarding is the experience of European Council for Fatwa and Research, where I see that the interaction with a context, European context, where you have some notion of plurality, humanism, make this council, make jurisdictions, fatwas, amazingly different from what we saw elsewhere. Even I saw, for instance, Sheikh al-Qardawi being based on Qatar is different from this European fatwa founded by al-Qardawi. So it means that the impact, the materiality, the working conditions of Muslim Islamic ethicists is very important. So what is your what do you think about my
No, you're raising. I mean, this is a very important point. I don't imagine an Islamic ethical monolith. I think that anyone that speaks in the name of the Islamic in a monolithic fashion rather than a proposal, an utruha, if you will, in Arabic, a proposed Islamically inspired normative framework. That's what I much prefer, because I completely agree with you. There are very diverse Islamic normativities. In fact, you take the theological discourses of Muslims in the U.S., they're quite different from Muslims in France, Muslims in Britain, Muslims in Italy, leave alone Muslims in Malaysia, Indonesia, Jordan, and so on and so forth. And but what what I am talking about is maybe more narrow. I think of theologian like or Jewish inspired philosopher like Levinas or Martin Buber, and or the natural law theologians in the Christian tradition, and the way that they adapted their own traditions, being inspired by their own traditions, to articulate philosophical moral frameworks that challenge and interrogate what nation states negotiate in international law. And I long for a Muslim voice. I honestly do not understand why aren't there the equivalent of natural law theorists in the Muslim context. You can't study international ethics without reading natural law theorists who are inspired by Christianity. You cannot really talk about the human rights, the philosophy of human rights, without reading the various Jewish philosophers who wrote about the marginal others and marginality, and the role of the marginal in interrogating the powerful, and again, they're inspired by the Jewish tradition and the wealth of their own tradition. When it comes to Muslims, they're completely absent. I mean, their presence is always apologetic. If it's Sheikh Al Azhar or some other formal institution or some voice that speaks to the international community, they're obsessed with the notion of just proving to the international community that Islam doesn't conflict with whatever the world wants. But I don't see Muslim voices that push the envelope, that in fact provide a moral critique, and that imagine a moral trajectory for humanity inspired by the Islamic tradition. This is not to say that any philosopher can have any type of monopoly over the Islamic. And in fact, I think that is one of the big fatal flaws, is that every scholar that starts dealing with the Islamic, they often think that they carry the burden of articulating the Islamic decisively and embracing all of it in a form of ijma' of sorts. So they're often scared to explore issues that would fall out of a perceived ijma' of sorts, and that tends to cripple Muslim thinkers. If you are worried about orthodoxy from the get-go, you cannot let your moral imagination flow, and deconstructing the idea of the Islamic monolith perhaps can have a freeing effect on moral Muslim ethical theorists. I mean, right now, the other than people like Tariq Ramadan or Surush or so on, we have very, very limited input by Islamically inspired moral theorists. And that's what I find very problematic, very troubling. I mean, colonialism it's now been a long time since World War II, and we've been waiting for the birth of Muslim voices in the plural, but it hasn't happened. And I think it's imperative that Muslims take a very deep look into what is crippling them, what is preventing them from having the Islamic tradition make a serious contribution to world civilization as it exists today. In my world, I see the shortage of Islamic normative contributions as a glaring absence, because I'm often, every day I'm in contact with Christian theorists and Jewish theorists and Buddhist theorists and Baha'i theorists, and there is much more nuance and far greater contributions than the Muslim counterpart. I see that as a serious problem.
Thank you very much. Dina.
Thank you so much, Professor. I really enjoyed your talk. My name is Dina Taha. I am from the Sociology Department at York University in Toronto. And when I say Toronto, it's 1 a.m. in Toronto, which means that I'm practically sleeping right now. I'll try to be organized though. So I have one comment and a question or request to expand a little bit. So the comment is about.
Keep it short.
I'm sorry?
Please keep it short.
Very short. So the comment is about going back to the Turkey issue. I was wondering if talking about Turkey as an example and moving beyond post-nationalism. I just think that when we want to assess the situation, we want to be a little to be a bit critical and take the whole situation. So I'm wondering if what is the stance when it comes to the EU-Turkey deal about paying millions of dollars to Turkey in an exchange of keeping the refugees,
Yeah.
if we consider that into the equation, and raise Turkey from issues such as Kurds, for example, regarding post-nationalism. That is the comment. The other thing that I really appreciated about your talk is being how the Muslim scholars are being crippled and they bound themselves by being apologetic and just defending themselves against the international law and not going beyond that. And I'm going to speak here as a sociologist as well, and my question is about other historical, colonial, and racist aspects in determining this international law. So specifically, the international human rights law was designed, especially for refugees, was designed after World War II for a specific kind of refugee, mostly the Eastern European refugee. And that really challenges the image of the current immigrant or forced migrants who are unfortunately mostly Muslims. So I was wondering if you can expand a little bit on that.
No, I mean, the point well taken, and I think that is part of what motivates me. I mean, I'm not a sociologist or an anthropologist. I'm a jurist, a lawyer, and so we speak in normativities. And you're absolutely right. The essential core of the problem with displacement in the modern age is that there has been a significant pattern of racial hypocrisy in the way we have dealt with refugee law. So, for instance, when our glorious American president made the comment about shithole countries, and unfortunately, he was expressing a reality that when we talk about assimilation in European countries and the issues of refugees, in reality, or in the United States, what we're talking about is that we want refugees, and especially Muslim refugees and Middle Eastern refugees, to perform whiteness, and that's their form of assimilation. And if they don't perform whiteness, then they become a problem. And when they and unfortunately, as a lawyer, I've been practicing asylum law and refugee law now for 30 years, and I can tell you that the way we implement asylum law, while we readily recognize a Coptic claim against Muslims as deserving asylum from Coptic from Egypt, these cases are very easy for me to win. When I have a Muslim who's persecuted because of his Islamic opinions from Egypt, it's very difficult to win these asylum cases, and I immediately recognize the ideological bias, the racial bias. In the case of the Copt, there is a belief that Copts are able to perform whiteness and to become whites, to assimilate through whiteness, while Muslims do not have, or at least are far more difficult to perform the same role of whiteness and dilute their identity. The reason I say that is that, yes, and absolutely the law, the international law, and one of the big paradoxes of human rights law beyond the Refugee Convention is that while it articulates itself in universal precepts that are extremely attractive, the sociological practice has been extremely problematic, and the issue of double standards has plagued the field, especially in the context of war on terror and the way we've handled the war and terror and the laws, national security laws in various non-Muslim countries, especially Western countries. The moral interrogation is the only way that we can keep the law accountable. Otherwise, it is really difficult it is rather quite easy for lawyers to equate between positive law and ethical normativity. which is a false paradigm. Positive law often fails our ethical demands. And that's where I see an important role for the Islamic tradition. In many ways, I just want Muslims to catch up in moral discourses and ethical discourses. For the life of me, with a very powerful tradition of mu'akha and a very powerful tradition of diyafa, and when I see the practice of Muslim countries, it's quite shocking and quite sad. It's as if the tradition is being emptied of its soul and its spirit. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor, for a very enlightening talk. My name is Khaled Abou El Fadl from the University of Sussex, and a part-time geographer of some kind. I really appreciate the way you articulated Hijra as being a normative moral response in face of oppression, inequity, and powerlessness. And I thought that echoes a lot of the literature that we currently have around autonomy of migration and Sandra Matsadra's work looking at the right to stay, right to escape, and right to return. I think also you very much all-grounded your talk around the framework of national sovereignty. And I think this is really the elephant in the room, right? So when we look at international law, and arguably you could say that international law is just colonialism kind of writ large today, we need to interrogate it further. And if we look at the 1951 Geneva Convention in particular, it talks about persecution of all founded bears on particular grounds. And you can see that coming from a particular European history, going back as far back as the Huguenots in the 17th century. And when you look at that case, you find that it's the state, or the King Charles, I think it's Charles I at the time, it was a state that granted asylum. So in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, we all have the right to seek asylum. But the granting of asylum comes from the state. And I'm wondering, how do we today, in this world, where national sovereignty pretty much trumps everything else? I think there's an anthropologist by the name of Lisa Malky who talks about a sedentarist metaphysics. This idea that the nation state is the rightful container for all the political, economic, and social life. How can we kind of challenge the power of that sedentarist metaphysics? Given that in Islam we have a tradition where it's not necessarily the state which grants protection, people can do so themselves.
Right. No, I mean, I really appreciate your comment, because it goes back to the emergence and origins of international asylum law, and the fact that the former colonial countries have, in fact, in many ways, the international order projects their own historical legacy, and there has been, there has been efforts by regional treaties and regional conventions in South America or in Africa to define a refugee and displaced individuals in a different way than the international order, but they have had a very limited impact on the way international law is practiced, or, for instance, in defining the agenda of the High Commissioner's Office for Refugees, or in articulating the way that international aid societies function. I don't think power dynamics are power dynamics, and anyone that begins this journey imagining that they're going to bring balance to the imbalance of power in the modern world is on a fool's errand. In the age of globalization, power has become so imbalanced that we have a real crisis even in the way epistemology is constructed in our modern world. For instance, compare the way discourses in Western institutions define the way we talk about the idea of political Islam, or the idea of jihadi Islam, or the idea of fundamental Islam. These are all categories that were invented in Western institutions and then exported to Muslims, and Muslims adapted them. This to me reflects exactly that dynamic of extreme imbalance of power. Nevertheless, I think the issue is the role of the conscientious intellectual. I mean, the conscientious intellectual must continue, again using a Muslim concept, must continue doing their shahada, their testimonials, and their testimonials as to truth. To use the well-known, maybe well-worn-out statement of speaking truth to power. In reality, I mean, it is speaking a different consciousness to to try to interject it among the realities that the powerful impose upon the world. So one of the way that the world ignores economic displacement and considers if you're dying of starvation to be not a relevant matter deserving of refuge, but if you are dying because you are targeted for your religious belief to be a matter deserving of refuge, continuing to interrogate these discourses with honest bravery, I think is our only option. Perhaps one day it would become possible for countries to emerge, to create a greater balance of power in the world. But that's something we cannot control. What we can control is what we testify to, and our testimonials cannot fall in the trap of simply rubber stamping whatever the power dynamics that exist in the world are. This is much more a reality perhaps in the world of law, where a lot of people get sucked into simply affirming and rubber stamping whatever international standards are proclaimed by the powerful. Perhaps much more of a reality than the world of sociology, where you do empirical research and you effectively testify as to what that empirical research informs you about. But nevertheless, I mean, it's an inadequate response, but it's the only response I can think of.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Professor Malik Hamdan from the Center for Legislation and Ethics. I agree with you that there are some gaps in the international law and the human rights law and the refugee law too, as you mentioned, for example, Article 33 from the 1951 Convention. But when you talked about the durable solution or sustainable solution for forced migration, I think there are serious problems here. And of course, number one is that when we talk about this phenomenon, we don't address the real root causes of the problems, specifically war, violence, and also the political, social, economic exclusion. And this, particularly in the Muslim world and the Arab world, is the real cause for forced migration. And number two, also in the international level, when we see, for example, 5 members of the United Nations Security Council, they have the veto power and they can exercise it any time. Of course, this complicated the issue and will pose more challenges to the durable solution. Another issue is the issue of money and budget, because when we look at for example, the UNHCR budget, more than approximately 90% of its budget comes from the top 10 donors, which are Western countries. But they put conditions, because that's specifically named the earmarked fund, which means there will be no funding for any project that is, for example, is purely on a humanitarian basis. And I take the example, for example, of the Palestinian refugees overseas. And of course, we cannot think of any durable solution while, for example, the colonial power is still there. In their terms, in the Western terms, of course, durable solution for the Palestinians is just to let them to settle down here and there and to continue their life, but not to solve the real problem, which is the colonial power. Thank you.
No, I agree with every point you made. I couldn't have put it better. You articulated it perfectly.
Thank you. Dr. Abou, maybe I could ask a question or put a point. You mentioned earlier on of Germany. You raised the issue of Germany taking refugees, Syrian refugees in particular, a large number.
Yeah.
Part of the debate that has ensued since that has been issues about that it was not just a humanitarian gesture, but also because the German workforce needed to be increased. So there was a dual element to the numbers that Germany took. And as a result of that, well, actually the debate has been going for some time about the idea of mixed migration, where you have both so-called economic migrants and refugees needing the same things, following the same trajectories, and so on and so forth, which has prompted a debate about amending the 51 Convention. And I was wondering if you wanted to comment on that, because that has developed a discussion around, let's say, the Gulf states that are not signatories to the 51 Convention, but have taken in Syrians, but not classified as refugees. And there are debates about Islamic principles rather than using the 51 Convention. Well, that's one issue. The other one was about you mentioned the African Union, the 69 Convention of the African Union.
Right.
The UNHCR does now acknowledge the idea of a prima facie refugee status, which it has done, I think, well, for some countries have allowed that for Syrian refugees. So there's a slight movement by UNHCR also in that direction, which is consistent with the African Union Convention. Could you comment on those? Thank you.
The first issue, I mean, I can. The proposal to revise the 51 Refugee Convention and, of course, the protocols. My reading of the situation is that I doubt very much that will happen, because there are a considerable amount of opposition to the idea of incorporating within the convention a definition that would in any way, even in certain limited formats, be more accommodating towards economic refugees. And here I'm talking about the very pronounced opposition from the State Department and the White House, and marshalling allies against that notion. Nevertheless, the Gulf countries, I mean, are a very big issue. One of the challenges that has seized the Muslim world since colonialism is a severe imbalance in economic resources between various Muslim countries. Gulf countries have not only not signed the Refugee Convention, but have been rather, how do I diplomatically put it, rather zealous in maintaining a privileged status for the whatever way each country defines citizenship, and have developed a pattern, a pattern and practice of various laws that violate, in my view, human rights standards and labor law, that often facilitate situations where there's effectively human trafficking, whether that in the case of Dubai includes labor and sexual human trafficking. In the case of other countries or other areas, labor trafficking. So not just the problem of refugees and the problem of displaced individuals, but violations that even go beyond that. And I think that there is, I mean, I will even perhaps propose a provocative idea that I've lived in a number of Gulf countries when I was younger, and one of the most striking thing is, and again, I'm not a sociologist, but I'm throwing it in there for perhaps sociologists to investigate, is that since independence and since the imbalance in wealth, at the international level, Gulf countries are torn between, on the one hand, zealously protecting their wealth and in exclusivist ways vis-a-vis other Muslims, but at the same time performing as if performing whiteness, where if you're Western and white, you get a privileged status within Gulf countries. When I examine the way that countries like the UAE, the Emirat, has been trying to reclaim the Islamic tradition, I'm always struck by the way that they seem to want to re-articulate Islam in ways that, the best way to say it is performing whiteness. I'll give just a minor example, and forgive me for that. But among the things that I often listen to are channels of Qur'an, Iza'at Qur'an Kareem. And there is a certain tradition and style to these radio broadcasts of the Quran. The one that comes from Abu Dhabi and Dubai are fascinating because they recast التواشيح or الابتهالات in a way that sounds amazingly Western. So even the way that you articulate Islamic dua, it sounds like Western a cappella groups, rather than the traditional Eastern tawashih or ibtihal and so on. It's a legacy of on the one hand exclusivist policy to protect wealth, but on the other hand being attracted to the performance of whiteness. So I mean, this Gulf countries pose a fascinating example on their own, and they haven't been studied enough, and they haven't been, especially countries like Saudi Arabia and the Emirat, and the way they've been handling the Yemeni refugees, or the way they've been handling complaints of trafficking in their countries. they really have not been sufficiently studied and have not been sufficiently held to account. As to the UNHCR and its move towards both the African definition of a displacement and the South American Convention as well, I see that as extremely positive. UNHCR, in my experience, is generally ideologically more inclusive. It is under an enormous amount of pressure to respond to what the main financiers, as the comment earlier about where the money comes from, the type of pressure that they place on the office of the High Commissioner to respond to certain situations, to fill in an ad hoc fashion to certain situations. But ideologically, that office in particular is ideologically more inclusive than a lot of other human rights, international law institutions. It's been has a tradition of being sympathetic to understandings of refugee status that is not limited to the historically embedded Western conception of asylum. And they have a very rich tradition of that. Maybe perhaps from grassroots interactions with the High Commissioner's office, which is often staffed by very vibrant and ideologically motivated personnel and lawyers, which again it's very interesting in the way that international law could be pollinated to become more inclusive and more ideologically sensitive. It's a very good case study of that.
Yes, I agree with you. Thank you very much. And we can acknowledge that UNHCR has made interventions for internally displaced.
Absolutely.
And from time to time with Palestinians, despite the role of UNRWA.
Yeah.
We have reached our deadline, and I want to thank you so much for your participation and your patience with all of the questions. We enjoyed your presentation very much.
It's my absolute pleasure, and please accept my apologies for not being physically with you again. It is my great loss, and thank you so much for putting up with me. Thank you.
The next best thing. Thank you very much.
Bye.